I'm going to really cut into the podcast this week because I don't want to waste any time with it. So this is the week. This is after Turkey Day. This is Sunday the 28th, Monday the 29th week. And the quote for this week goes something like this. First of all, I want to remind you, welcome to the weekly podcast. I decided to change it because I am planning to really be committed and go for this for the long haul. So, I'm trying to make it fluid and, get, not like monthly where it's like so little. So if you have strength or character, you can use that as fuel to not only be a survivor, but to transcend simply being a survivor. Use an internal alchemy to turn something rotten and horrible into gold. That was by Zena Shrake. So strength, being a survivor, being courage, and I think it's so powerful in Glass Castle. Scars can not only be, from like physically on your face, but they can also be emotionally and mentally. So this week is all about gathering up strength, as you can see in the title, How to Cultivate Strength. So then this week's poem is Dunes by GABRIEL JESIOLOWSKI. It says, "We floated to sleep as the house beams were carved with birds and waves through the night, not knowing how to walk through sand dunes, not knowing the sand blue color of your veins. It is tiring to wake each day to the frost, your own breath, melancholy smooth." And then I want to get to today's short story or Nordic fairy tale. Yes, we're doing another one of these, but this is obviously going to be a different one. Oh, what a cliche, so obvious, I know, right? Okay, so forget that I said that. This is actually one that I started, and this was the one that was the monster. So, I'm going to break this up into little sections, just because this one is a bit of a longer one. So what I'm going to do is below in the description, actually, for this week, you can find the no. Okay, sorry about that. Okay, well, let's begin. So this is by Hans Christian Andersen, who is a Danish Nordic Scandinavian. This is a story from the sand dunes, or sand hills, of Jutland, though it does not begin in Jutland. the northern peninsula, but far away in the south, in Spain. The ocean is the high road between the nations. Transport thyself thither in thought of sunny Spain. There it is warm and beautiful. There no fiery pomegranate blossoms flourish among the dark laurels. From the mountains a cool, refreshing wind blows down upon and over the orange gardens, over the gorgeous Moorish hills with their golden cupolas and colored walls. Through the streets go children in procession, with candles and with waving flags, and over them, lofty and clear, rises the sky with its gleaming stars. There is a sound of song and of castanets, and youth and maidens join in the dance under the blooming acacias. I'm just zooming it out so that it looks like less, ironically. While the Mercidian sits upon the hewn marble stone, refreshing itself with a juicy milk, and dreamily enjoying life, the whole is like a glorious dream, and there was a newly married couple who completely gave themselves up to its charm. Moreover, they possessed the good things of this life, health and cheerfulness of soul, riches and honor. We are so happy as it is possible to be, exclaimed the young couple. From the depths of their hearts they had indeed but one step more to mount in the ladder of happiness, in the hope that God would give them a child, a son like them in form and in spirit. The happy child would be welcomed with rejoicing, would be tended with all care and love, and enjoy every advantage that wealth and ease possessed by an influential family could give. And the days went by like a glad festival. Life is a precious, gracious gift of Providence, an almost incomprehensible gift, said his wife, and yet they tell us that fullness of joy is found only in the future life, forever and ever. I cannot compass the thought. And perhaps the thought arises from the arrogance of men, said the husband. It seems a great pride to believe that we shall live forever, that we shall be as gods. Were these not the words of the serpent, the origins of falsehood? Surely you do not doubt the future life, exclaimed the young wife, and it seemed as if one of the first shadows flitted over the sunny heavens of her thoughts. Faith promises it, and the priests tell us so, replied the man. But amid all my happiness, I feel that it is arrogance to demand a continued happiness, another life after this. Has not so much been given us in the state of existence that we ought to be, that we must be contented with it? Yes, it has been given to us, said the young wife. But to how many thousands is not this life one scene of hand trial? How many had been thrown into the world, as if only to suffer poverty and shame and sickness and misfortune? If there were no life after this, everything on earth would be too unequally distributed, and the Almighty would not be unjust as itself. Yonder beggar, replied the man, has his joys which seem to him great, which rejoice him as much as the king is rejoiced in the splendor of his palace. And then, do you not think that the beast of burden, which suffers blows and hunger, and works itself to death, suffers from its heavy fate? The dumb beast might likewise demand a future life, and declare the decree unjust that does not admit it into a higher place of creation. He has said, "In my Father's house are many mansions," replied the young wife. "Heaven is immeasurable, as the love of our Maker is immeasurable. Even the dumb beast is his creature, and I firmly believe that no life will be lost, but that each will receive the amount of happiness which he can enjoy, and which is sufficient for him." "The world is sufficient for me," said the man, and he threw his arms around his beautiful, amiable wife, and then smoked his cigarette on the open balcony, where the cool air was filled with the fragrance of oranges and pinks. The sound of music and the clatter of castanets came up from the road. The stars gleamed above, and two eyes full of affection, the eyes of his wife, looked on him with an undying glance of love. "Such a moment," he said, "makes it worth while to be born. To fail and to disappear," and he smiled. The young wife raised his hand in mild reproach, and the shadow passed away from her world, and they were happy, quite happy. Everything seemed to work together for them. They advanced in honor and prosperity and in joy. There was a change indeed, but only a change of place, not an enjoyment of life and of happiness. The young man was sent by his sovereign as ambassador to the court of Russia. This was an honorable office, and his birth and his acquirements gave him a title to be thus honored. He possessed great fortune, and his wife had brought him wealth equal to his own, for she was the daughter of a rich and respected merchant. One of this merchant's largest and finest ships was to be dispatched during that year to Stockholm, and it was arranged that the dear young people, the daughter and the son-in-law, should travel in it to St. Petersburg, and all the arrangements on board were princely, rich carpets for the feet, and silk and luxury on all sides. In an old heroic song, the King's Son of England, it says, "Moreover, he sailed in a gallant ship, and the anchor was gilded with ruddy gold, and each rope was woven through with silk. And the ship involuntarily rose in the mind of him who saw the vessel from Spain. For here was the same pomp, and the same parting thought naturally arose," he thought. "God grant that we all enjoy once more may meet again." And the wind blew fairly seaward from the Spanish shore, and the parting was to be but a brief one, for in a few weeks the voyagers would reach their destination. But when they came out upon the high seas, the wind sank, the seas became calm and shining, the stars of heaven gleamed brightly, and they were festive evenings that were spent in the sumptuous cabin. At length the voyagers began to wish for wind, for a favoring breeze, but the breeze would not blow, or if it did arise, it was contrary. Thus weeks passed away, 2 full months, and then at last a fair wind blew. It blew from the southwest. The ship sailed on the high seas between Scotland and Jutland, and the wind increased just as in the old song of the King's Son of England. And it blew a storm, and the rain came down, and they found not land nor shelter. And forth they threw their anchor of gold, as the wind blew westward toward Denmark. This all happened a long, long while ago. King Christian VII then sat on the Danish throne, and he was still a young man. Much has happened since that time. Much has changed, or has been changed. Sea and moorland have been converted into green meadows. Health had become arable land, and in the shelter of the west, jute huts grow apple trees and rose bushes, though they certainly require to be sought for, as they bend beneath the sharp west wind. In western Jutland one may go back in thought to the old times, farther back than the days when Christian VII wore rule, as it did then in Jutland. The brown heath now also extends for miles, with its huts, Huns' graves, and aerial spectacles, and its crossing sandy, uneven roads westward, when large rivulets run into the bays, extend marshes and meadowland, girdled with lofty sand hills, which, like a row of Alps, raise their peak summits toward the sea, only broken by the high, cleary ridges from which the waves year by year bite out huge mouthfuls, so that the impending shores fall down as if by the shock of an earthquake. Thus it is today, and thus it was many, many years ago, when the happy pair were sailing in the gorgeous ship. It was in the last days of September, a Sunday, and sunny weather, that the chiming of the church bells in the bay of Nizam was wafted along like a chain of sounds. The churches there are erected almost entirely of hewn boulder stones, each like a piece of rocks. The North Sea might foam over them, and they would not be overthrown. Most of them were without steeples, and the bells are hung between two beams in the open air. The service was over, and the congregation thronged out of the churchyard, where then, as now, not a tree nor a bush was to be seen. Not a single flower had been planted there, nor had a wreath been laid upon the graves. Rough mounds show where the dead had been buried, and rank grass, tossed by the wind, grew thickly over the whole churchyard. Here and there a grave had a monument to show, in the shape of a half-decayed block of wood readily shaped into the form of a coffin. The said block having been brought from the forest of West Jutland, but the forest of West Jutland is the wild sea itself, where the inhabitants find the hewn beams and planks and fragments, which the breakers cast ashore. The wind and the sea fog soon destroy the wood. One of these blocks had been placed by loving hands on a child's grave, and one of the women who had come out of the church stepped towards it. She stood still in front of it, and her last glance rested on the discolored memorial. A few moments afterward her husband stepped up to her. Neither of them spoke a word, but he took her hand, and they wandered across the brown heath, over moor and meadow, towards the sand hills. For a long time they thus walked silently side by side. That was a good sermon today, the man said at length. If we had not God to look to, we should have nothing. Yes, observed the woman. He sends joy and sorrow, and he has a right to send them. Tomorrow our little boy would have been 5 years old, if we had been allowed to keep him. You will gain nothing by fretting, wife, said the man. The boy is well provided for. He is there whither we pray, or go. And they said nothing more, but went forward to their house among the sandhills. Suddenly, in front of one of the houses, where the sea grass did not keep the sand down with its twining roots, there arose what appeared to be a column of smoke rising into the air. A gust of wind swept among the hills, whirling the particles of sand high into the air. Another, and the strings of fish hung up to dry, flapped and beat violently against the wall to heighten, and it was all still again. The sun shone down hotly. Man and wife stepped out of the house. They'd soon taken off their Sunday clothes, and emerging again, they hurried away over the dunes, which stood there like huge waves of sand suddenly arrested in their course, while the sandweeds and the dung grass with its bluish stalks spread a changing couleur over them. We neighbors came up, helped one another to draw the boats up higher into the sand. The wind now blew more sharply than before. It was cutting and cold, and when they went back over the sand hills, sand and little pointed stones blew into their faces. The waves reared themselves up, their white crowns of foam, and the wind cut off their crests, flinging the foam far around. The evening came on, and the air was a swelling roar, moaning and complaining like a troop of despairing spirits that sounded above the hoarse rolling of the sea. For the fisher's little hut was on the very margin. The sand rattled against the window panes, and every now and then came a violent gust of wind that shook the house to its foundations. It was dark, but towards midnight the moon would rise. The air became clearer, but the storm swept in all its gigantic force over the perturbed sea. The fisher people had long gone to bed, but in such weather there was no chance of closing an eye. Presently there was a knocking at the window, and the door was opened, and a voice said, "There's a great ship fast stranded on the outermost reef." In a moment the fish had sprung from their couch, and hastily arrayed themselves. The moon had risen. It was light enough to make the surrounding objects visible to those who could open their eyes for the blinding clouds of sand. The violence of the wind was terrible, and only by creeping forward between the gusts was it possible to pass among the sandhills. And now the salt spray flew up from the sea like down, while the ocean formed like a rolling cataract toward the beach. It required a precise eye to descry the vessel out in the offing. The vessel was a noble brig. The billows now lifted it over the reef, 3 or 4 cable lengths out of the usual channel. It drove towards the land, struck against the second reef, and remained fixed. To render assistance was impossible. The sea rolled fairly in upon the vessel, making a clean breach over her. Those on shore fancied they heard the cries of help from on board, and could plainly descry the busy, useless efforts made by the stranded crew. Now a wave came rolling onward, falling like a rock upon the bowsprit, and tearing it from the brig. The stern was lifted high above the flood. 2 people were seen to embrace and plunge together into the sea. In a moment more, and one of the largest waves that rolled towards the sandhills threw her body upon the shore. It was a woman, and appeared quite dead, said the sailors, but some women thought they discerned signs of life in her, and the stranger was carried across the sandhills into the fisherman's hut. How beautiful and fair she was! Certainly she must be a great lady. They laid her upon the humble bed that boasted not a yard of linen, but there was a woolen coverlet, and that would keep the occupant warm. Life returned to her, but she was delirious, and knew nothing of what had happened, or when she was, where she was, and it was better so, for everything she loved and valued lay buried in the sea. It was with her ship as the vessel in a song of the king's son of England. Alas, it was a grief to see how the gallant ship sank speedily. Portions of wreck and fragments of wood drifted ashore, as they were all that remained of what had been the ship. The wind still drove howling over the coast. For a few moments the strange lady seemed to rest, but she awoke in pain, and cries of anguish and fear came from her lips. She opened her wonderfully beautiful eyes and spoke a few words, but none understood her. And behold, as a reward for her pain and sorrow she had undergone, she held in her arms a newborn child, the child that was to have rested upon a gorgeous couch, surrounded by silken curtains, in the sumptuous home. It was to have been welcomed with joy to a life rich in all the goods of the earth, and now Providence had caused it to be born in this humble retreat. Not even a kiss did it receive from its mother. The fisher's wife laid the child upon the mother's bosom, and it rested on a heart that beat no more, for she was dead. The child, who was to be nursed by wealth and fortune, was cast into the world, washed by the sea among the sand hills, to partake the fate and heavy days of the poor. And here again comes into our mind the old song of the English king's son, in which mention is made of the customs prevalent at that time, when knights and squires plundered to those who had been saved from shipwreck. The ship had stranded some distance south of Nizambain. The hard and human days in which, as we have stated, the inhabitants of the Jutland shores did evil to the shipwrecked were long past. Affection and sympathy and self-sacrifice for the unfortunate were to be found, as they are to be found in our own time, in many a brilliant example. The dying mother and the unfortunate child would have found secure and help wherever the wind blew them. But nowhere could they have found more secure and help when the wind blew them, but nowhere they could have found more earnest care than in the hut of one fisher, who had stood but yesterday in a heavy heart beside the grave which covered a child, which would have been 5 years old that day, if God had spared it to live. No one knew who the dead stranger was, or could even form a conjecture. The pieces of wreck said nothing on the subject. Into the rich house in Spain, no tidings penetrated of the fate of the daughter and the son-in-law. They had not arrived at their destined post, and violent storms had raged during the past weeks. At last the verdict was given. Founded at sea, all lost. But in the sand hills near Hunsby, in the fisherman's hut, lived a little scion of the rich Spanish family. When heaven sends food for two, a third can manage to make a meal. And in the depths of the sea is many a dish of fish for the hungry. And they called the boy Jurgen. It must certainly be a Jewish child, the people said. It looks so swarthy. Might be an Italian or a Spaniard, observed the clergyman. But to the fishermen, these three nations seemed all the same, and she consoled herself with the idea that the child was baptized as a Christian. The boy throbbed. The noble blood in his veins was warm, and had become strong on his homely fare. He grew apace in his humble house, and the Danish dialect spoke by the West Jutes became his language. The pomegranate seed from Spanish soil became a hardy plant on the coast of West Shetland. Such may be a man's fate. To this home he clung with the roots of his whole being. He was to have experience of cold and hunger and his misfortunes and hardships that surrounded the humble, but he tasted also the poor man's joys. Childhood had sunny heights for all, whose memory gleams through the whole afterlife. The boy had many opportunities for pleasure and play. The whole coast for miles and miles was full of playthings, for it was a mosaic of pebbles, red as coral, yellow as amber, and others again white and rounded like birds' eggs, and all smooth and prepared by the sea. Even the bleached fish skeletons, the water plants dried by the wind, seaweed, white gleaming, and long linen like bands waving around the stones. All these seem made to give pleasure and amusement to the eye and the thoughts. And the boy had an intelligent mind. Many and great faculties lay dormant in him. How readily he retained in his mind the stories and songs he heard, and how neat-handed he was. With stones and mussel shells he put together pictures and ships, with which one could decorate the room, and he could cut out his thoughts wonderfully on a stick, his foster mother said, though the boy was still so young and little. His voice sounded sweetly. Every melody flowed at once from his lips. Many chords were attained in his heart, which might have sounded out into the world if it had been placed elsewhere than in the fisherman's hut by the North Sea. One day, another ship was stranded here. Among other things, a chest of rare flower bulbs floated ashore. Some were put into the cooking pots, for they were thought to be eatable, and others lay and shriveled in the sand. But they did not accomplish their purpose, or unfold the richness of color, whose germ was within them. Would it be better with Jurgen? Flower bulbs had soon played their part, but he had still years of apprenticeship before him. Neither he nor his friends remarked in what a solitary and uniform way one day succeeded another, for there was plenty to do and to see. The sea itself was a great lesson book, unfolding a new leaf every day, such as calm and storm, breakers and waves. The visits to the church were festal visits, but among the festal visits in the fisherman's house, one was particularly distinguished. It was repeated twice in the year, and was, in fact, the visit of the brother of the Georgian's foster brother, the eel breeder from Train, upon the neighborhood of the Bow Hill. He came in a cart painted red and filled with eels. The cart was covered and looked like a box, and painted all over with blue and white tulips. It was drawn by 2 dun oxen, and Jurgen was allowed to guide them. The eel breeder was a witty fellow, a merry guest, and brought a measure of brandy with him. Everyone received a small glassful or a cupful when there was a scarcity of glasses. Even Jurgen had as much as a large thimbleful, that he might digest the fat eel. The eel breeder said, who always told the same story over again, and when the hearers laughed, he immediately told it over again to the same audience. As during his childhood and even later, Jordan used many expressions from his story of the eel breeders, and made use of it in various ways. It is as well that we should listen to it too. Here it is. The eels went into a bay, and the mother eel said to her daughters, who begged leave to go a little way up the bay, "Don't go too far. The ugly eel spearer might come and snap you all up," if they went too far. And of 8 daughters, only 3 came back to the eel mother, and these wept and said, "We only went a little way before the door, and the ugly eel spearer came directly and stabbed 5 of our party to death." "They'll come again," said the mother eel. "No," exclaimed the daughters, "for he skinned them and cut them in 2 and fried them." "Oh, they'll come again," the mother eel persisted. "No," replied the daughters, "for he ate them up." "They'll come again," repeated the mother eel. "But he drank brandy after them," continued the daughter. "Ah, then they'll never come back," said the mother, and she burst out crying. "It's the brandy that burned Mary's face." "And therefore," said the eel breeder, "in conclusion, it is always right to take brandy after eating eels." The eel breeder's visit. And the story was, in tinsel thread, the most humorous recollection of Jurgen's life. He likewise wanted to go a little way outside the door and up the bay, that is to say, out into the world in a ship. And his mother said, like the eel breeder, there are so many bad people, eel spearers. But he wished to go a little way past the sand hills, a little way into the dunes, and he succeeded in doing so. 4 merry days, the happiest of his childhood, unrolled themselves, and the whole beauty and splendor of Jutland, all the joy and sunshine of his home, was concentrated in these. He was to go to a festival, though it was certainly a burial feast. A wealthy relative of the fisherman's family had died. The farm lay deep in the country, eastward, and a point toward the north, as the saying is. Jurgen's foster parents were to go, and he was to accompany them from the dunes. Across heath and moor, they came to the green meadow, where the river Scorm rolls its course, the river of many eels, where mother eels dwell with their daughters, who are caught and eaten up by wicked people. But men were said sometimes to have acted no better towards their own fellow men. for he had not the night Sir Bug had been murdered by wicked people, and though he was well spoken of it, had he not wanted to kill the architect? As the legend tells us, who had built for him the castle with the thick walls and the tower, where Jurgen and his parents now stood, and where the river falls into the bay. The wall on the rampart still remained, and red crumbling fragments lay strewn around. Here it was that Sir Bug, after the architect had left him, said to one of his men, "Go thou after him and say, Master, the tower shakes. If he turns round, you are to kill him, and take from him the money I paid him. But if he does not turn round, let him depart in peace." The man obeyed, and the architect never turned around, but called back, "The tower does not shake in the least, but one day there will come a man from the west in a blue cloak, who will cause it to shake." And indeed, so it chanced 100 years later, for the North Sea broke in and the tower was cast down, but the man who then possessed the cattle, Prebjorn Gildestenjerne, built a new castle higher up at the end of the meadow, and that stands to this day and is called Nori Vosburg. Past this castle went Jurgen and his foster parents. They had told him its story during the long winter evenings, and now he said the lordly castle, with its double moat and trees and bushes, the wall, covered with ferns, rose within the moat. But most beautiful of all were the lofty lime trees, which grew up to the highest windows, and filled the air with sweet fragrance. In a corner of the garden, toward the northwest, stood a great bush full of blossom, like winter snow amid the summer's green. It was a juniper bush, the first that Jurgen had seen thus in bloom. He never forgot it, nor the lime trees, the child's soul, and treasured up these remembrances of beauty and fragrance to gladden the old man. From Nori Vosburg, where the juniper blossomed, the way went more easily, for they encountered other guests who were also bound for the burial, and were riding in wagons. Our travelers had to sit all together on a little box at the back of the wagon, but even this was preferable to walking, they thought. So they pursued their journey in the wagon across the rugged heath. The oxen which drew the vehicle slipped every now and then, where a patch of fresh grass appeared amid the heather. The sun shone warm, and it was wonderful to behold how, in the far distance, something like smoke seemed to be rising, and yet the smoke was clearer than the mist. It was transparent, and looked like rays of light rolling and dancing afar over the heath. "That is Lokeman driving his sheep," said someone, and this was enough to excite the fancy of Jurgen. It seemed to him as if they were now going to enter fairyland, though everything was still real. How quiet it was! Far and wide the heath extended around them like a beautiful carpet. The heather bloomed, the juniper bushes and the fresh oak saplings stood up like nosegays from the earth, an inviting place for a frolic. If it were not for the number of poisonous adders of which the traveler spoke, as they did also of the wolves which formerly infested the place, from which circumstance the region was still called the Wolfsburg region. The old man who guided the oxen related how, in the lifetime of his father, the horses had to sustain many a hard fight with the wild beasts that were now extinct. And now he himself, when he went out one morning to bring in the horses, had found one of them standing with its forefeet high on a wolf it had killed, after the savage beast had torn and lacerated the legs of the brave horse. The journey over the heath and the deep sand was only too quickly accomplished. They stopped before the house of mourning, where they found plenty of guests within and without. Wagon after wagon stood ravaged in a row, and horses and oxen went out to crop the scanty pasture. Great sand hills, like those at home in the North Sea, rose behind the house and extended far and wide. How had they come here, miles into the interior of the land, and as large and high as those on the coast? The wind had lifted and carried them hither, and to them also history was attached. Psalms were sung, and a few of the old people shed tears. Beyond this, the guests were cheerful enough, as it appeared to Georgian, and there was plenty to eat and drink. Eels there were of the fattest, upon which brandy should be poured to bury them, as the eel grater said, and certainly his maxim was here carried out. Georgian went to and fro in the house. On the third day he felt quite at home, like as in the fisherman's hut on the sand hills where he passed his early days. Here on the heath there was certainly an unheard of wealth, for the flowers and blackberries and bilberries were to be found in plenty, so large and sweet that when they crushed beneath the trade of the passers-by, the heath was coloured with their red juice. Here was a Hun's grave, and yonder another. Columns of smoke rose into the still air. It was a heath fire, he was told. It shone so splendidly in the dark evening. Now came the fourth day, and the funeral festivities were to conclude, and they were to go back from the land dunes to the sand dunes. Ours are the best, said the old fisherman. Georgian's foster fathers, these have no strength. And they spoke of the way in which the sand dunes had come into the country, and it seemed all very intelligible. This was the explanation they gave. A corpse had been found on the coast, and the peasants had buried it in the churchyard, and from that time the sand began to fly and the sea broke in violently. A wise man in the parish advised them to open the grave in the parish, and to look if the buried man was not lying sucking his thumb, for if so, he was a man of the sea, and the sea would not rest until it had got him back. So the grave was opened, and he really was found with his thumb in his mouth. So they had him upon a cart and harnessed 2 oxen before it, and as if stung by an adder, the oxen ran away with the man in the sea, over heath and moorland to the ocean, and then the sand ceased flying inland, but the hills that had been heaped up still remained there. All this Georgian heard and treasured in his memory from the happiest days of his childhood, the days of the burial feast. How glorious it was to get into the strange regions and to see strange people. And he was to go farther still, He was not yet 14 years old when he went out in a ship to see what the world could show him. Bad weather, heavy seas, malice, and hard men. These were his experiences, for he became a ship boy. There were cold nights and bad living, and blows to be endured. Then he felt as if his noble Spanish blood boiled within him, and bitter, wicked words seethed up to his lips. But it was better to gulp them down, though he felt as the eel must have felt when it was flayed and cut up, and put in the frying pan. "I shall come again," said a voice within him. He saw the Spanish coast, the native land of his parents. He even saw the town where they had lived in happiness and prosperity. But he knew nothing of his home or race, and the race knew just as little about him. The poor ship boy was not allowed to land, but on the last day of his stay, he managed to get ashore. There were several purchases to be made, and he was to carry them on board. There stood Jurgen in his shabby clothes, which looked as if they had been washed in the ditch and dried in the chimney. For the first time he, the inhabitant of the dunes, saw a great city. How lofty the houses seemed, and how full of people were the streets, some pushing this way, some that, a perfect maelstrom of citizens and peasants, monks and soldiers, a calling and shouting and jingling of bell-harnessed asses and mules, and the church bells chiming between song and sound, hammering and knocking, all going on at once. Every handicraft had its home in the basements of the houses or in the lanes, and the sun shone so hotly, and the air was so close, that one seemed to be an oven full of beetles, cockroaches, cockroaches, bees, and flies, all humming and murmuring together. Jurgen hardly knew where he was or which way he went. Then he saw just in front of him the mighty portal of the cathedral. The lights were gleaming in the dark aisles, and a fragrance of incense was wafted toward him. Even the poorest beggar ventured up the steps to the temple. The sailor with whom Jurgen took went his way through the church, and Jurgen stood in the sanctuary. Colored pictures gleamed from their golden ground. On the altar stood the figure of the Virgin, with the child Jesus surrounded by light and flowers. Priests in festive garb were chanting, and choir boys, beautifully attired, swung the silver censer. What splendor, what magnificence did he see here? It streamed through his soul and overpowered him. The church and the faith of his parents surrounded him, and touched a chord in his soul so that tears overflowed his eyes. From the church they went to the marketplace. Here a quantity of provisions were given him to carry. The way the harbor was long, and tired and overpowered by various emotions. He rested for a few moments before a splendid house, with marble pillars, statues, and broad staircases. Here he rested his burdens against the wall. Then a liveried porter came out, lifted up a silver-headed cane, and drove him away. Him, the grandson of the house, But no one there knew that, and he just as little as anyone. And afterwards he went on board again, and there were hard work and cuffs, little sheep, and much work. Such were his experiences. They say that it is well to suffer in youth, if age brings something to make up for it. This time of servitude on shipboard had expired, and the vessel lay once more at Ringobing in Jutland. He came ashore, and went home to the sand dunes by Hunsby, but his foster mother had died when he was away on his voyage. A hard winter followed that summer. Snowstorms swept over land and sea, and there was difficulty in getting about. How variously things were disturbed in the world. Here, biting cold and snowstorms, while in the Spanish land was burning sunshine and oppressive heat. And yet, when here at home there came a clear frosty day, and Jurgen saw the swans flying in numbers from the sea toward the land, and across to Vosborg, it appeared to him that people could breathe more freely here. And here too was a splendid splendid summer. In imagination he saw the heath bloom and grow purple with rich, juicy berries, and saw the elder trees and the lime trees at Vosburg in blossom. He determined to go there once more. Spring came on, and the fishery began. Jurgen was an active assistant in this. He had grown in the last year, and was quick at work. He was full of life, and he understood how to swim, to tread water, to turn over and tumble in the flood. They often warned him to beware of the troops of dogfish, which could seize the best swimmer and draw him down and devour him, but such was not Jurgen's fate. At the neighbors on the dune was a boy named Martin, with whom Jurgen was very friendly, and the two took service in the same ship to Norway, and also went together to Holland, and they had never had any quarrel, but a quarrel can easily come, for when a person is hot by nature, he often uses strong gestures, and that is what Jurgen did one day on board when they had a quarrel about nothing at all. They were sitting behind the cabin door, eating out of a delf plate, which they had placed between them. Jurgen held his pocket knife in his hand, and lifted it against Martin, and at the same time became ashy pale in the face, and his eyes had an ugly look. Martin only said, "Aha, you're one of that sort, who are fond of using the knife." Hardly were the words spoken, when Jurgen's hand sank down. He answered not a syllable, but went on eating, and afterwards walked away to his work. When they were resting again, he stepped up to Martin and said, "You may hit me in the face. I have deserved it, but I feel as if I had a pot in me that boiled over." "There let the thing rest," replied Martin, and after that they were almost doubly as good friends as before, and when afterwards they got back to the dunes and began telling their adventures, this was told among the rest, and Martin said that Jurgen was certainly passionate, but a good fellow for all that. They were both young and strong, well grown and stalwart, but Jurgen was the cleverer of the two. In Norway the peasants go into the mountains, and laid out the cattle there to pasture. On the west coast of Jutland, huts have been erected among the sand hills. They are built of pieces of wreck and roofed with turf and heather. They are sleeping places along the walls, and there the fisher people live and sleep during the early spring. Every fisherman has his female helper, his manager, as she is called, whose business consists in baiting the hooks, preparing the warm beer for the fishermen when they came ashore, and getting their dinners cooked when they came back into the hut tired and hungry. Moreover, the managers bring up the fish from the boat, cut them open, prepare them, and have generally a great deal to do. Jurgen, his father, and several other fishermen and their managers inhabited the same hut. Martin lived in the next one. One of the girls, Els by name, had known Jurgen from childhood. They were glad to see each other, and in many things they were of the same mind. But in outward appearance they were entirely opposite, for he was brown, whereas she was pale, and had flaxen hair and eyes as blue as the sea in sunshine. One day, as they were walking together, and Jurgen held her hand in his very firmly and warmly, she said to him, "Jurgen, I have something weighing upon my heart. Let me be your manager, for you are like a brother to me, whereas Martin, who has engaged me, he and I are lovers, but you need not tell them that to the rest." And it seemed to Jurgen of the loose sand were giving way under their feet. He spoke not a word, but only nodded his head, which signified yes. More was not required, but suddenly he felt in his heart that he had detested Martin, and the longer he considered of this, for he had never thought of else in this way before, the more did it become clear to Martin that had stolen from him the only being he loved, and now it was all once plain to him that else was being in question. When the sea is somewhat disturbed, and the fishermen come home in their great boat, it is a sight to behold how they cross the reefs. One of the men stands upright in the bow of the boat, and the others watch him, sitting with their oars in their hands. Outside the reef they appear to be rowing not towards the land, but backing out to sea, till the man standing in the boat gives them the sign that the great wave is coming, which is to float them across the reef, and accordingly the boat is lifted high in the air, so that its keel is seen from the shore, and in the next minute the whole boat is hidden from the eye. Neither mast nor keel nor people can be seen, as though the sea had devoured them. But in a few moments they emerge like a great sea animal climbing up the waves, and the oars move as if the creature had legs. The second and the third reef are passed in the same manner. And now the fishermen jump into the water. Every wave helps them and pushes the boat well forward, till at length they have drawn it beyond the range of the breakers. A wrong order given in front of the reef, the slightest hesitation, and the boat must founder. Then it would be all over with me, and Martin too. This thought struck Jurgen while they were out at sea, where his foster fathers had been taken alarmingly ill. The fever had seized him. They were only a few oar strokes from the reef, and Jurgen sprang from his seat and stood up in the bow. "Father, let me come," he said, and his eye glanced toward Martin and across the waves. But while every oar bent with the excursions of the rowers, as the great wave came towering towards them, he beheld the pale face of his father, and dare not obey the evil impulse that had seized him. The boat came safely across the reef to land, but the evil thought remained in his blood, and roused up every little fiber of bitterness which had remained in his memory since he and Martin had been comrades. But he could not weave the fibers together, nor did he endeavor to do so. He felt that Martin had despoiled him, and this was enough to make him detest his former friend. Several of the fishermen noticed this, but not Martin, who continued obliging and talkative, the latter a little too much. Jurgen's adopted father had to keep his bed, which became his deathbed, for in the next week he died, and now Jurgen was installed as heir in the little house behind Sandhills. It was but a little house, certainly, but still it was something, and Martin had nothing of the kind. "You will not take sea service again, Jurgen," observed one of the old fishermen. "You will always stay with us now." But this was not Jurgen's intention, for he was just thinking of looking about him a little in the world. The eel breeder of Zeeltring had an uncle in Elskage who was a fisherman, but at the same time a prosperous merchant, who had ships upon the sea. He was said to be a good old man, and it would not be amiss to enter his service. Elskage lies in the extreme north of Jutland, as far removed from the Hunsby Dunes as one can travel in that country, and this is just what pleased Jurgen, for he did not want to remain till the wedding of Martin and Else, which was to be celebrated in a few weeks. Else affirms his preferences for Martin. The old fisherman asserted that it was foolish now to quit the neighborhood where that Jurgen had a home, and Else would probably be inclined to take him rather than Martin. Jurgen answered so much at random that it was not easy to understand what he meant, but the old man brought Else to him, and she said, "You have a home now that ought to be well considered." And Jurgen thought of many things. The sea had heavy waves, but there are heavier waves in the human heart. Many thoughts, strong and weak, thronged through Jurgen's brain, and he said to Else, "If Martin had a house like mine, whom would you rather have?" But Martin had no house and could not have one. But let us suppose he had one. Why then I would certainly take Martin, for that's what my heart tells me. But one can't live upon that. And Jurgen thought of these things all night through. Something was working within him. He could not understand what it was, but he thought that was stronger than the love for Else. And so he went to Martin, and what he said and did were well considered. He left the house to Martin on the most liberal terms, saying that he wished to go to sea again, because it pleased him to do so, and Else kissed him on the mouth when he heard that, for she loved Martin best. In the early morning, Jurgen purpose to start. On the evening before his departure, when it was already growing late, he felt a wish to visit Martin once more. He started, and among the dunes the old fisher met him, who was angry at his going. The old man made jokes about Martin, and declared there must be some magic about his fellow, of whom all the girls were so fond. Jurgen paid no heed to this speech, but said farewell to the old man, and went on towards the house where Martin dwelt. He heard loud talking within. Martin was not alone, and this made Jurgen waver in his determination, for he did not wish to encounter else, and on second consideration he thought it better not to hear Martin thank him again, and therefore turned back. The following morning, before break of day, he fastened his knapsack, took his wooden provision box in his hand, and went away among the sand hills toward the coast path. The way was easier to traverse than the heavy sand road, and moreover shorter, for he intended to go in the first instant to Zelbring by Boberg, where the eel breeder lived, to whom he had promised a visit. The sea lay pure and blue before him, and mussel shells and sea pebbles, the playthings of his youth, crunched under his feet. While he was thus marching on, his nose suddenly began to bleed. It was a trifling incident, but little things can have great significances. A few large drops of blood fell upon one of his sleeves. He wiped them off and stopped the bleeding, and it seemed to him as if this had cleared and lightened his brain. In the sand, the sea moringa was blooming here and there. He broke off a stalk and stuck it in his hair. He determined to be merry and of good cheer, for he was going into the wide world, a little way outside the door in front of the hay. As the young eels had said, beware of bad people who will catch you and flay you, cut you in two, and put you in a frying pan. He repeated in his mind and smiled, for he thought he should find his way through the world. Good courage is a strong weapon. The sun already stood high when he approached the narrow entrance to Newsom Bay. He looked back and saw a couple of horsemen galloping a long distance behind him, and they were accompanied by other people. But this concerned him nothing. The ferry was on the opposite side of the bay. Jurgen called to the ferryman, and when the latter came over with the boat, Jurgen stepped in. But before they had gone halfway across, the men, who had seen riding so hastily behind him, hailed the ferryman and summoned him to return in the name of the law. Jurgen did not understand the reason of this, but he thought it would be best to turn back, and therefore himself took an oar and returned. The moment the boat touched the shore, the men sprang on board, and before he was aware, they had bound his hands with the rope. Thy wicked deed will cost thee thy life, they said, was accused of nothing less than murder. Martin had been found dead, with a knife thrust through his neck. One of the fishermen had, late in the precious evening, met Jurgen going towards Martin's house, and this was not the first time Jurgen had raised his knife against Martin, so they knew that he was the murderer. The town in which the prison was built was a long way off, and the wind was contrary for going there. But not half an hour would be required to get across the bay, and a quarter of an hour would bring them from thence to Neuvausburg, a great castle with walls and ditches. One of Jurgen's captors was a fisherman, a brother of the keeper of the castle, and he declared it might be managed that Jurgen should be, for the present, be put into the dungeon at Vosburg, where long Martha the gypsy had been shut up till her execution. No attention was paid to the defense made by Jurgen. The few drops of blood upon his shirt sleeve bore heavy witness against him. But Jurgen was conscious of innocence, and as there was no chance of immediately righting himself, he submitted to his fate. The party handed just at the spot where Sir Fuchs' castle had stood, and where Jurgen has walked with his foster parents after the burial feast. During the 4 happiest days of his childhood, he was led by the old path over the meadow to Vosburg, and again the elder blossomed and the lofty lindens smell sweet, and it seemed but yesterday that he had left the spot. In the 2 wings of the castle, a staircase leads down to a spot below the entrance, and from thence there is access to a low vaulted cellar. Here long Martha has been imprisoned, and hence she has been led away to the scaffold. She has eaten the hearts of 5 children, and had been under the delusion that if she could obtain 2 more, she would be able to fly and to make herself invisible. In the midst of the cellar roof was a little narrow air hole, but no window. The blooming lindens could not waft a breath of comforting fragrance into that abode, where all was dark and moldy. Only a rough bench stood in the prison, but a good conscience is a soft pillow, and consequently Jurgen could sleep well. The thick oaken door was locked, and secured on the outside by an iron bar, but the goblin of superstition should he not creep in here, where Jurgen sat thinking of long Martha and her evil deeds, her last thought on the night before her execution had filled the space, and of the magic came into Jurgen's mind, which tradition asserted to have been practiced there in the old times, where Sir Squanenzel dwelt there. All this passed through Jurgen's mind, and made him shudder. But a sunbeam, a refreshing thought from without, penetrated his heart. Even here, it was the remembrance of the blooming elder in the fragrant wine trays. He was not left there long. He carried him off the town of Rittersling, where his imprisonment was just as hard. Those times were not like ours. Hard measures were dealt out to the common people, and in just after the days where farms were converted into knights' estates, on which occasions coachmen and servants were often made magistrates, and had in their power to sentence a poor man for a small offense to lose his property and to corporal punishment. Judges of this kind were still to be found, and in Jutland, far from the capital and from the enlightened, well-meaning head of the government, the law was still sometimes very loosely administered, and the smallest grievance that Jurgen had to expect was that his case would be protracted. Cold and cheerfulness was his abode. And when would this state of things end? He had innocently sunk into misfortune and sorrow. That was his fate. He had leisure now to ponder on the difference of fortune on earth, and to wonder why this fate had been allotted to him, and he felt sure that the question would be answered in the next life. The existence that awaits us when this is over, this faith had grown strong in him in the poor fisherman's hut, that which had never shone into his father's mind, and all the richness and sunshine of Spain was bull-shafted as a light of comfort in his poverty and distress, a sign of Mary from God that never deceives. The spring storms began to blow. The rowing and moaning of the North Sea could be heard for miles inland where the wind was lulled, for then it sounded like the rushing of 1,000 wagons over a hard road with a mine beneath. Jurgen, in his prison, heard these sounds, and it was a relief to him. No melody could have appealed so directly to his heart as did these sounds of the sea, the rolling sea, the boundless sea, on which a man could be borne across the world before the wind, carrying his own house with him wherever he is driven, just as the snail carries its home even in a strange land. How he listened to the deep moaning, and how the thought arose in him, "Free, free, how happy to be free, even without shoes and in ragged clothes." Sometimes where such thoughts crossed his mind, the fiery nature rose within him, and he beat the wall with his clenched fists. Weeks, months, a whole year had gone by when a vagabond, Niels, the thief, also called also the horse cooper, was arrested. And now the better times came, and it was seen what wrong Jurgen had endured. And in the neighborhood of Ringerbing, at a beer house, Niels, the thief, had met Martin on the afternoon before Jurgen's departure from home, and before the murder. A few glasses were drunk, not enough to cloud anyone's brain, but yet enough to loosen Martin's tongue, and he began to boast and to say that he had obtained a house and intended to marry. And when Niels asked when he intended to get the money, Martin shook his pocket proudly and said, "The money is there where it ought to be." This boast cost him his life, For when he went home, Niels went after him and thrust a knife through his throat to rob the murdered man of the expected gold, which did not exist. This was circumstantially explained, but for us it is enough to know that Jurgen was set at liberty. But what amends did he get for having been imprisoned a whole year, and shut out from all communion with men? They had told him he was fortunate in being proved innocent, and that he might go. The burgomaster gave him $2 for traveling expenses, and many citizens offered him provisions and beer. There were still good men, not all grind and flay, but the best of all was that the merchant Brone of Skajan, the same into whose service Jurgen intended to go into a year since, was just at that time on business in the town of Riomjobing. Brom heard the whole story, and the man had a good heart, and understood what Jurgen must have felt and suffered. He therefore made up his mind to make it up to the poor lad and convince him to go, that there were still kind folks in the world. So Jurgen went forth from the prison as if to paradise to find freedom, affection, and trust. He was to travel this road now, for no goblet of life is all bitterness. No good man would pour out such measure to his fellow man. And how should he do it, who is love itself? Let us all be buried and forgotten, said Brone the merchant. Let us draw a thick line through last year, and we will even burn the calendar, and in 2 days we'll start for dear, friendly, peaceful Skagen. They call it Skagen, an out-of-the-way corner, but it's a good warm chimney corner, and its window opens toward every part of the world. That was a journey. It was like taking fresh breath out of the cold dungeon air into the warm sunshine. The heath stood blooming in its greatest pride, and the herd boy sat on the Hun's grave and blew his pipe, which he had carved for himself out of the sheep's bone. Fata Morgana, the beautiful aerial phenomenon of the desert, showed itself with hanging gardens and swaying forests, and the wonderful cloud phenomenon, called here the Lokeman driving his flock, was seen otherwise. Up through the land of the Wendels, up towards Skagen they went, from whence the men with the long beards, the Longobardi or Lombards, had emigrated in the days when, in the region of King Sino, all the children and the old people were to have been killed, till the noble Dame Gamburuk proposed that the young people had better emigrate. All this was known to Jurgen. Thus much knowledge he had, and even if he did not know the land of the Lombards beyond the high Alps, he had an idea how it must be there, for in his boyhood he had been in the south, in Spain. He thought of the southern fruits piled up there, of the red pomegranate blossoms, of the humming, murmuring, and toiling in the great beehive of a city he had seen. But after all, home is best, and Jurgen's home was Denmark. Surgeon's better fortune. Surgeon's better fortune. At length they reached JESIOLOWSKI, as Skagen is called in the New Norwegian and Icelandic writings. They are already Old Skagen, with the western and eastern town extending for miles, with sand hills and arable land as far as the lighthouse near the Skandjewing, Skagensweg. Then as now, the houses are strewn among the wind-raised sand hills, desert where the wind sports with the sand, where the voices of the sea and the wild swans strike harshly on the ear. In the southwest, a mile from the sea, lies Old Skagen, and here dwelt merchant GABRIEL, and here Jurgen was henceforth to dwell. The great house was painted with tar. The smaller buildings had each an overturned boat for a roof. The pigsty had been put together of pieces of wreck. There was no fence here, for indeed there was nothing to fence in, but long rows of fishes were hung up upon lines, one above the other, to dry in the wind. The whole coast was strewn upon spoiled herrings, for there were so many of those fish that a net was scarcely thrown into the sea before they were caught by cardboards. There were so many that often they were thrown back into the sea, or left to lie on the shore. The old man's wife and daughter, and the servants too, came rejoicingly to meet him. There was a great pressing of hands, and talking and questioning. And the daughter, what a lovely face and bright eyes that she had. The interior of the house was roomy and comfortable. Fritters like a king would have looked up upon as a dainty dish were placed on the table, and there was wine from a vineyard of Skagen, that is, the sea, for there the grapes come ashore ready pressed and prepared in barrels and in bottles. What the mother and daughter heard who Jurgen was and how innocently it had suffered, they looked at him in a still more friendly way, and the eyes of the charming Clara were the friendliest of all. Jurgen found a happy home in Old Skagen. It did his heart good, and his heart had been sorely tried, and he had drunk the bitter goblet of love, which softens or hardens the accordance of circumstances. Jurgen's heart was still soft, it was young, and there was still room in it, and therefore it was well that Mistress Clara was giving in 3 weeks to her father's ship to Christianland in Norway to visit an aunt, and to stay there in the long winter. On the Sunday before her departure, they all went to church, to the Holy Communism. The church was large and handsome, and had been built centuries before Scotchmen and Hollanders. It lay at a little distance from the town. It was certainly somewhat ruinous, and the road to it was heavy, through the deep sand, but the people gladly went through the difficulties to get to the house of God, to sing psalms, and hear the sermon. The sand had heaped itself all up around the walls of the church, but the grasses were kept free from it. It was the largest church north of the Limford, the Virgin Mary, with the golden crowns on her head, and the child Jesus in her arms, stood lifelike upon the altar. The holy apostles had been carved in the choir, and on the wall hung portraits of the old burgmasters and councillors of Skagen. The pulpit was of carved work. The sun shone brightly into the church, and its radiance fell on the polished brass chandelier and on the little ship that hung from the vaulted roof. Jurgen felt as if overcome by a holy childish feeling, like that which possessed him where, as a boy, he had stood in the splendid Spanish cathedral. But here the feeling was different, for he felt conscious of being one of the congregation. After the sermon followed the Holy Communism. He partook of the bread and wine, and it happened that he knelt beside Mistress Clara, but his thoughts were so fixed upon heaven and the holy service that he did not notice the neighbor until he rose from his knees, and then he saw tears rolling down her cheeks. 2 days later, she left Skagen and went back to Norway. He stayed behind and made himself useful in the house and in the business. He went out fishing, and at the time fish were more plentiful and larger than now. Every Sunday, when he sat in the church and his eyes rested upon the statue and the Virgin of the altar, his glance rested for a time on the spot where Mistress Clara had knelt beside him, and he thought of her, how hearty and kind she had been to him. And so the autumn and the winter time passed away. There was wealth here, and a real family life, even down to the domestic animals, which were all kept. The kitchen glittered with copper and tin and white plates, and from the roof hung hams and beef, and winter stores in plenty. All this is still to be seen in many rich farms of the west coast of Jutland. Plenty to eat and drink, clean, decorated rooms, clever heads, happy tempers, and hospitality prevail there as in an Arab tent. Never since the famous burial feast had Jurgen spent such a happy time, and yet Mistress Clara was absent, except in the thoughts and memory of all. In April, a ship was to start for Norway, and Jurgen was to sail in it. He was full of life and spirits, and looked so stout and jovial that Dame Brome declared it did her good to see him. "And it's a pleasure to see you too, old wife," said the old merchant. "Jurgen has brought life into our winter evenings, and into you too, mother. You look younger this year, and you seem well and bonny. But then you were once the prettiest girl in Viborg, and that's saying a great deal, for I have always found the Viborg girls the prettiest of any." Jurgen said nothing to this, but he thought of a certain maiden of Skagen, and he sailed to visit that maiden, for the ship steered to Christian land in Norway, and a favoring wind bore it rapidly to that town. One morning, Merchant Brion went out to the lighthouse that stands far away from old Skagen. The coal fire had long gone out, and the sun was already high when he mounted the tower. The sand banks extend under the water a whole mile from the shore. Outside these banks, many ships were seen that day, and with the help of the telescope, the old man thought he described his own vessel, the GABRIEL. Yes, surely there she was. The ship was sailing up with Georgian and Clara, both on board. The church and the lighthouse appeared to them as a heron and a swan rising from the blue waters. Clara sat on deck and saw the sand hills gradually looming forth. If the wind held, she might reach her home in about an hour. So near were they to home and its joys. So near were they to death and its terrors. For a plank in the ship gave way and the water rushed in. The crew flew to the pumps and attempted to stop the leak. A signal in distress was hoisted, but they were still a full mile from the shore. Fishing boats were in sight, but they were still far distant. The wind blew shoreward, and the tide was in their favor too, but all was insufficient, for the ship sank. Georgian threw his right arm about Clara and pressed her close to him. With what a look she gazed in his face, as he threw himself in God's name into the water with her. She uttered a cry, but still she felt safe, certain that he would not let her sink. And now, in the hour of terror and danger, Georgian experienced what the old song told. And written it stood, how the brave king's son embraced the bride his valor hath won. How rejoiced he felt that he was a good swimmer. He worked his way onward with his feet and with one hand, while with the other he tightly held the young girl. It rested upon the waves. He trode the water. He practiced all the arts he knew, so as to reserve strength enough to reach the shore. He heard how Clara uttered a sigh, and felt a convulsive shudder pass through her, and he pressed her to him closer than ever. Now and then a wave rolled over her, and he was still a few cables' length from the land, where help came in the shape of an approaching boat. But under the water he could see it clearly. Stood a white form gazing at him, a wave lifting him up, and a form approached him. He felt a shock, and it grew dark, and everything vanished from his gaze. On a sand reef lay the wreck of a ship. The sea washed over it. The white figure had leant against an anchor. The sharp iron extended just to the surface. Georgian had come in contact with this, and the tide had driven him against it with double force. He sank down, fainting with his load, but the next wave lifted him and the young girl aloft again. The fishermen grasped them and lifted them into the boat. The blood streamed down Georgian's face. He seemed dead, but the still clutched this girl so tightly that they were obliged to loosen her by force from his grasp, and Clara lay pale and lifeless in the boat that now made for the shore. All means were tried to restore Clara to life, but she was dead. For some time he had been swimming onward with the corpse. He had exerted himself to exhaustion for one who was dead. Georgian was still breathing. The fishermen carried him into the nearest house upon the sandhills. A kind of surgeon who lived there, and was at the same time a smith and a general dealer, bound up Georgian's wounds in a temporary will, till a physician could be next day from the nearest town. The brain of the sick man was affected. In delirium he uttered wild cries, but on the third day he lay quiet and exhausted on his couch, and his life seemed to hang by a thread, and the physician said it would be best if the string snapped. Let us pray that God may take him home to itself. He will never be the same man again. But life would not depart from him. The thread would not snap, but the thread of memory broke. The thread of all his mental power had been cut through. And what was most terrible, a body remained, a living, healthy body that wandered about like a spectre. Georgian remained in the house with the merchant Brion. He contracted his illness in his endeavor to save our child, said the old man, and now he is our son. People called Georgian imbecile, but that was not the right expression. He was like an instrument in which the strings are loose and will sound no more, only at times in a few moments they regain their power, and then they sounded anew. Old melodies were heard, snatches of song, pictures unrolled themselves, and then disappeared again in the midst. And once more he sat staring before him without a thought. We may believe that he did not suffer, but his dark eyes lost their brightness, and looked only like black, clouded gas. Poor imbecile Georgian, said the people. He it was whose life was to have been pleasant, that it would be presumption and pride to expect or believe in a higher existence hereafter. All his great mental faculties had been lost. Only hard days, pain and disappointment had been lost. He was like a rare plant tore from its native soul, and thrown upon the sand to wither there, and was the image, fashioned in God's likeness, to have no better destination? Was it to be merely the sport of chance? No, the all-loving God would certainly repay him in his life to come, for what he had suffered and lost here. The Lord is good to all, and his mercy is over all he works. These words from the Psalms of David, the old pious wife of the merchant, repeated in patience and hope, and the prayer of her heart was that Georgian might soon be summoned to enter into the life eternal. In the churchyard, where the sand blows across the walls, Clara lay buried. It seemed as if Georgian knew nothing of this. It did not come within the compass of her thoughts, which comprised only fragments of a past time. Every Sunday he went with the old people to church, and sat silent there with vacant gaze. One day, while the psalms were being sung, he uttered a deep sigh, and his eyes gleamed. They were fixed upon the altar, upon the place where he had knelt with his friend, who was dead. He uttered her name and became pale as death, and tears rolled over his cheeks. They led him out of the church, and he said to the bystanders that he was well, and had never been ill. He, the heavily afflicted, the waif cast forth upon the world, remembered nothing of his sufferings. And the Lord, our Creator, is wise and full of loving kindness. Who can doubt it? In Spain, where the warm breezes blew over the Moorish cupola, among the orange trees and laurels, where song and the sound of castanets were always heard, sat in the sumptuous house a childish old man, the richest merchant in the place, while children marched in procession through the streets, with waving flags and lighted tapers. How much of his wealth would the old man not have given to be able to press his child to his heart, his daughter or her child, that had perhaps never seen the light in the world, far less a paradise? Poor child! Yes, poor child. A child still, and yet more than 30 years ago, for to that age Georgian had attained the old station. The drifting sand had covered the graves in the churchyard quite up to the walls of the church, but yet the dead must be buried among their relations and loved ones which had gone before them. Merchant Brony and his wife now rested here with their children under the white sand. It was springtime, the season of storms. The sandhills whirled up in clouds, and the seas ran high, and flocks of birds blew like clouds in the storms, shrieking across the dunes, and shipwreck followed shipwreck on the reefs of Way from towards the Hunsby dunes. One evening, Georgian was sitting alone in the room. Suddenly his mind seemed to become clearer, and a feeling of unrest came upon him, which in his younger years had often driven him forth upon the heath and the sandhills. "Home, home!" he exclaimed. No one heard him. He went out of the house toward the dunes. Sand and stones blew into his face and whirled around him. He went on farther and farther toward the church. The sand lay high around the walls, half over the windows, but the leaf had been shoveled away from the door, and the entrance was free and easy to open, and Georgian went into the church. The storm was howling over the town of Skachin. Within the memory of man, the sea had not run so high. A terrible tempest. But Georgian was in the temple of God, and while black night reigned without, a light arose in his soul, a light that was never to be extinguished. He felt that the heavy stone which seemed to weigh upon his head burst asunder. He thought he heard the sound of the organ, but it was the storm and the moaning of the sea. He sat down on one of the seats, and behold, the candles were lighted up one by one. A richness was displayed, such as he had only seen in the church in Spain, and all the pictures of the old counselors were endured with life, and stepped forth from the walls against which they had stood for centuries, and seated themselves in the entrance of the church. The gates and doors flew open, and in came all the dead people, festively clad, and sat down to the sound of beautiful music, and filled the seats in the church. Then the psalm tune rolled forth like a sounding sea, and his old foster parents from the Hunsby Dunes were here, and the old merchant Brion and his wife, and at their side, close to Georgian, sat their friendly, lovely daughter, Clara, who gave her hand to Georgian, and they both went to the altar, where they had once knelt together, and the priest joined their hands and joined them together for life. Then the sound of music was heard again, wonderful, like a child's voice, full of joy and expectation, and it swelled on to an organ sound, to a tempest of full, noble sounds, lovely and devouring to hear, and yet strong enough to burst the stone tombs. And the little ship that hung down from the roof of the choir came down, and became wonderfully large and beautiful, with silken sails and golden yards, and every rope wrought through with silk. As the old song said, the married pair were on board, and the whole congregation with them, for there was room and joyfulness for all, and the walls and arches and the church bloomed like a juniper, and the fragrant lime trees, and the leaves and branches waved and distributed coolness. Then they bent and parted, and the ship sailed through the midst of them, through the sea, and through the air, and every church taper became a star, and the wind sang a psalm tune, and all sang with the wind. And love to glory, no life shall be lost, full of blessedness and joy. Hallelujah! And these were the words that the Georgians spoke last in this world. The thread snapped that bound the immortal soul, and nothing but a dead body lay in the dark church, around which the storm raged, covering it with a loose sand. The next morning was Sunday, and the congregation and their pastor went forth to the service. The road to church had been heavy. The sand made the way almost impassable, and now, when they were last reached their goal, a great hill of sand was piled up before their entrance, and the church itself was buried. The priest spoke a short prayer, and said that God had closed the door of this house, and the congregation must go and build a new one for him elsewhere. So they sang a psalm under the open sky and went back to their homes. Georgian was nowhere to be found in the towns of Skagen or in the dunes. However much they sought for him, it was thought that the waves which had rolled far up on the sand had swept him away. His body lay buried in a great sepulchre. In the church itself, in the storm, the Lord's hand had thrown a handful of earth on his grave, and the heavy mound of sand lay upon it, and lies there to this day. The whirling sand had covered the high vaulted passages. Whitethorn and wild rose trees grew over the church, over which the wanderer now walls, while the tower, standing forth like a gigantic tombstone over a grave, is to be seen for miles around. No king has a more splendid tombstone. No one disturbs the rest of the dead. No one knew of this, and we were the first who knew of this grave. The storms sang the tale to me among the sandhills. And that's it. I hope that you enjoyed this podcast. I know it was a longer one, and I will see you next week.